She jumped from the train 2 miles short of Denver because an old woman had whispered the truth in her ear. The man who had bought her had buried 3 wives already. She would have been the fourth. So she ran into a Colorado blizzard in a silk dress and fine leather shoes, and she lay down in the snow to die. And then 3 shadows came out of the pines. The biggest one knelt beside her, and what he carried in his arms that night would change every life on Thorn Mountain forever. Now, folks, pull up a chair. Let me tell you about Cordelia Whitmore and the Thorn brothers. The iron wheels hammered against the tracks, clack, clack, clack. To most folks riding west that November of 1874, the sound meant progress. It meant a future being built 1 mile at a time, somewhere out past the edge of the known world. But to the young woman sitting alone in the private car, the sound was different. To Cordelia Whitmore, it sounded like a clock counting down the minutes to her own execution. She was 22 years old. Her hair was the color of honey held up to sunlight. Her eyes were the blue of cornflowers in a Boston summer. She wore a navy traveling dress of imported silk fitted at the waist with a small cameo brooch at her throat, and she had not eaten in nearly 2 days. Folks, before we go on tonight, I want you to know something. This is a story about a woman who chose the cold over a man, a woman who chose the wilderness over a wedding ring, and 3 brothers on a mountain who had not spoken to another living soul in a long, long time. If you love stories about hard country and harder love, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. I love hearing where the campfire reaches. Now lean back, pull up a chair. Let me tell you about Cordelia Whitmore and the Thorn brothers. She had been called Della since she was a child. Her mother had given her that name on her deathbed 14 years before this train began moving west. Her father, the Reverend Nathaniel Whitmore of Boston, had raised her after that with all the dignity a man of his station could muster. He taught her to read before she was 4. He taught her to set a proper table. He taught her that a Whitmore woman never lifted her chin in pride and never lowered it in shame. And then when Della was 22 years old, he sat her down in his study and told her he had ruined them both. A man he had trusted, a deacon in his own church, had taken the savings of half the congregation. The Reverend had co-signed the man's notes. The bank wanted the house, the wagon, the very pew Nathaniel preached from, and the only way out, the only way to preserve what little dignity remained to the Whitmore name was a contract written in ink and signed in blood, though no one called it that. A man named Reginald Ashworth Sterling, a banker out of Denver, had answered the advertisement in a Boston paper. A man of means, the letter said, a widower, 3 times over, lonely on the high plains and in want of a wife of breeding and Christian character. He had sent money, a great deal of money, enough to settle the Reverend's debts and leave a little besides. And in exchange, the Reverend had promised him Della. She had not wept. Whitmore women did not weep, not in the parlor, not at table, not even at funerals. She had simply nodded and gone upstairs and packed a single trunk in a single carpet bag, and she had boarded the train at the South Station 3 days later, with her father's blessing pressed to her forehead like a wound. What happened on that train, folks, was what changed everything. It was on the second night somewhere past Chicago that the old woman found her. The old woman was small and bent with white hair, tied up under a black bonnet, and she had been watching Della for a long time before she finally crossed the aisle and sat down. She did not introduce herself. She did not ask Della's name. She simply leaned in close enough that Della could smell peppermint on her breath, and she said one thing. I knew Reginald Sterling. Della felt the iron wheels of the train slow inside her own chest. I knew his first wife, the old woman said. Eliza, pretty thing, 20 years old, married him in the spring of '68, buried her in the fall of '69. They said it was consumption. He kept the house. The second one was a girl from St. Louis, Margaret, I believe. Buried her 2 years later. They said it was a fall down the back stairs. He kept the house. The third was a widow with a small fortune of her own. Buried her last winter. They said it was bad water from the well. The old woman paused. She looked at Della with eyes the color of stove iron. He kept the house every time she said, and then she stood up and walked away, and Della never saw her again. Della sat very still in the private car while the train rocked west. She did not cry. She did not call for the conductor. She simply opened her carpet bag and took out the small daguerreotype that Sterling had sent ahead, the one her father had placed on the mantel for 2 months before the wedding date was set. She looked at the picture. She looked at the eyes of the man who had bought her. They were the eyes of something that had forgotten how to feel. They were the eyes of a man who watched horses being broken and never once flinched. The conductor came through then swinging his lantern, and he smiled at her the way men had smiled at her all her life, the way men smile at pretty things they assume to be fragile. "Denver in 3 hours, miss," he said. "Big day for you. Bigger than you know, ma'am." Della smiled back. She had been raised to smile. But inside her chest, something had broken. Something small and final. The train began to slow. Not for Denver. Not yet. For a water stop. A frozen tower out in the foothills where the Colorado pines grew so thick the daylight could not reach the ground between them. Della heard the wheels groan. She heard the hiss of the steam. She felt the train shudder to a halt. She stood up. Her legs trembled. The corset under her silk dress felt like a cage made of bone. She walked to the door of the private car. She slid it open. The bite of mountain air hit her face like a slap, and it smelled of pine sap and snow and wood smoke from a fire she could not see, and it smelled like nothing she had ever known in Boston. It smelled like a country that did not care who her father was, a country that did not know what a Whitmore was, a country that would not bury her in a fine plot beside 3 other women who had also been bought and paid for. She stepped down onto the iron stair. The porters were busy at the water tank. The conductor was inside lighting the lamps for the next leg of the run. Nobody saw her. Nobody called her name. She walked. Then she ran. She ran across the clear ground beside the tracks, her fine leather shoes slipping on the icy gravel, her silk skirt catching on a rusted spike, tearing loose with a sound like the snapping of a thread that had held her whole life together. She ran into the dark wall of pines. She did not look back. She heard the conductor's whistle blow far behind her, that long, mournful sound that meant the train was leaving without her, and she kept running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees in the snow, and she finally allowed herself to laugh. She laughed because she was free. She laughed because she was 22 years old, and she had just walked away from her own grave. She did not know yet that she had walked into a different one. The mountain did not care. That is what the trappers say in those parts. The mountain does not care. The mountain does not see you. The mountain has been here 10,000 winters and will be here 10,000 more, and you are nothing but a small, warm thing crossing its skin for a single afternoon. For the first 30 minutes, Della did not feel the cold at all. The blood in her veins was singing. Her cheeks were flushed. She walked deeper into the pines, her silk dress whispering against the bracken, and she laughed quietly to herself at the absurdity of it. A Whitmore woman in a Paris dress walking alone through a Colorado forest. Her father would have fainted. Her aunts would have torn their hair. And here she was, alive. But adrenaline is a liar, folks. It always has been. It promises you warmth that is not there, and then it leaves you the moment you need it most. The first warning was her feet. The fine leather of her boots had been built for the marble floors of a Boston townhouse, not for the snow that came up over her ankles with every step. The leather soaked through in 10 minutes. By 20, she could no longer feel her toes. By 30, the silk hem of her dress was frozen stiff, dragging behind her like an iron skirt, and each step was a small, terrible labor. The second warning was the wind. It came down off the high peaks the way a hawk comes down on a field mouse, sudden and from above. It cut through the silk of her bodice as if she wore nothing at all. It found the small gap at her throat where the cameo brooch sat, and it drove the cold straight into her chest, into the place between her shoulder blades, into her bones. The third warning was the light. The sun was already setting. She had not realized how late it was when she ran. She looked up through the lattice of pine boughs and saw the sky going from blue to violet to the slow dark color of a healing bruise, and she understood for the first time what she had done. The mountain does not care. Winter does not negotiate. She tried to turn back. She tried to follow her own footprints to the tracks, but the wind had begun to drift the snow and the prints were gone. Every one of them swept clean as if she had never passed that way at all. The pines all looked the same. The slopes all rose the same. She turned in a slow circle, and she felt the laughter she had carried out of the train begin to die in her throat. Folks, I want you to imagine her there a moment. 22 years old, honey hair coming loose from its pins, a face white as paper, a silk dress not made for a country like this. A girl who had been raised on Latin verbs and pianoforte lessons, who had never split a single piece of kindling in her life, standing alone in a Colorado pine forest while the temperature dropped past zero. She was not afraid yet. Not really. Fear takes a moment to find you out there. What she felt first was something closer to wonder. The wonder of a person who realizes very slowly that they have made a decision they cannot take back. She kept walking. She had to keep walking. She knew that much from the book she had read. Stop walking and you die. So she walked. The light bled out of the sky, the wind rose, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady the way the worst snows always fall. By the time her legs gave out the second time, she could not feel her hands. She could not feel her face. The shivering had stopped, which she did not yet know was the worst sign of all. A strange warmth had begun to creep up her arms and into her chest, and she remembered dimly that her father had told her once that a man freezing to death feels warm at the end. She had not believed him then. She believed him now. She fell into a drift of fresh powder beside a fallen pine, and she did not get up. The snow was soft. It was almost kind. She lay on her side with her cheek pressed to the cold, and she watched the violet sky go black through the lattice of branches, and she thought of her father in his study, and she thought of her mother, who she could no longer quite remember, and she thought of the old woman on the train and the three dead wives, and she thought with a small, sad satisfaction, well, at least I will not be the fourth. Her eyes began to close. And that is when the shadows came. She did not see them at first. She heard them. 3 sets of boot falls, deep and crunching in the snow, coming down the slope toward her. Heavy men, big men, the kind of men a Boston woman would cross the street to avoid. She tried to lift her head. She could not. A voice spoke. It was deep and low. The kind of voice that sounded like it came from inside a stone. Wyatt, is she breathing? A second voice answered, lighter, sharper, with the edge of a man who could see in the dark. She is, but not for long. Caleb, that dress, look at the dress. Whoever she is, she does not belong out here. A third voice, quieter than the other two, almost a whisper. I will fetch the buffalo robe. Move her gentle. The cold has been in her too long. Della tried to speak. She tried to ask their names. She tried to ask if she was going to die. But her tongue had stopped working, and the only sound she could make was a small, white plume of breath that rose between her cracked lips. A shape blocked out the last of the light. A man knelt beside her in the snow. He was massive. He was wider at the shoulder than any man she had ever seen, and his hair was long and dark, and he wore a heavy coat of buffalo hide that smelled of smoke and pine. She could not see his face. The dusk was too deep, and his hat brim hid him. But his hands, she saw his hands. They were enormous. They were scarred across the knuckles. They were the kind of hands that could split a cord of wood without trembling, and they could break a man's neck without effort, and they could, she realized with a small shock that was almost more startling than the cold, they could lift her up as if she weighed nothing at all. And they did. He scooped her into his arms with a tenderness she had not expected from a body that large. He pulled her against the buffalo hide, and the smell of him filled her, and for the first time in 2 days she felt warm. "Easy now, ma'am," the deep voice said very close to her ear. "You are not going to die tonight. Not on this mountain, not while I am breathing." That was the last thing Cordelia Whitmore heard before the dark took her. She came back slowly, the way a swimmer comes up from a great depth. She heard the crackle of a fire before she saw it. She smelled wood smoke and something else, something unfamiliar, the rich, smoky smell of meat curing in a rafter. She felt the weight of furs over her body, heavy and warm. She felt the slow throb in her fingers and toes. That meant blood was coming back to places it had nearly forgotten. The pain was not gentle. It was 1,000 small needles pushing out through her skin from the inside. She gasped. She tried to sit up, and a voice she did not know spoke from a few feet away. "Easy. Stay down. Blood is moving. It is going to hurt before it gets better." Della opened her eyes. She was lying on a low cot piled with bear and buffalo robes in the largest log cabin she had ever seen. The walls were peeled timber wide as a man's chest fitted together with a craftsman's eye. A great stone fireplace took up half the far wall, and a fire burned in it the size of a man throwing orange light across the rafters. Above the fire, dark shapes hung from iron hooks. Smoked meat, drying herbs. The skin of a great bear stretched across the back wall like a black wing. There were 3 chairs at the long table by the fire, 3 coffee cups, 3 pairs of boots by the door, all of them larger than any boots she had ever seen. A man sat near the cot on a low wooden stool. He was younger than she expected, late 20s perhaps. His hair was the color of dark wheat falling loose around a sun-browned face, and his eyes were a clear gray that caught the firelight as he watched her. He had a tin cup in his hand. He held it out to her. "Willow bark," he said, "and honey. It will help with the shaking. My name is Wyatt, ma'am, Wyatt Thorne. You are safe here. You are warmer than you have been in some time, and you are going to be all right." Della tried to speak. Her voice came out as a dry rasp, where she said, "A long way from anywhere," Wyatt said gently. "We are 40 miles from the nearest town. You are on Thorn Mountain, ma'am. My brothers and I have lived up here 10 years. Drink this now." She drank. The warmth of it spread down into her chest, and she shut her eyes against the wave of dizziness that followed. A second man came in from a side door then. He was younger still, no more than 24, with hair the color of chestnuts and a quietness about him that filled the room without taking up any space. He carried a bundle of dried herbs in one hand and a small clay jar in the other. He nodded to her, did not smile, and set the jar by the cot. "This is my brother Silas," Wyatt said. "He is the one who knows what plants will heal you and which ones will kill you. He learned it from an old Scottish widow named Mrs. Hartwell, who lived a day's ride from here until last spring. She taught him every leaf and root for 10 miles in any direction. He will tend to your hands and feet tonight. They will hurt. He will not." Silas knelt by the cot. He pulled back the furs at the foot of the bed, and Della saw for the first time what the cold had done to her toes. They were swollen. They were the color of a winter plum. "Frostbite," Silas said quietly. "Not the worst I have seen. You will keep them. You will walk again, but it will take time." His voice was like his hands, careful, steady. He worked in silence after that, and Della felt for the first time the strange and terrible kindness of being tended to by men she did not know. She lay back. She stared at the rafters. She stared at the smoked meat hanging there, at the bear skin, at the row of long rifles racked above the door. There were 3 chairs at the table. There were 3 pairs of boots. There were 3 voices she had heard in the snow. "Where is the third one?" she said. "The big one." Wyatt and Silas looked at each other. It was a small look, the look of brothers who had spoken about her without her hearing. "He is outside," Wyatt said finally, "splitting wood for the night. He prefers the cold to company most evenings. He will come in when the work is done." "What is his name?" Della asked. "Caleb," Wyatt said. "Caleb Thorne. He is the eldest. He is the one who carried you off the mountain. And ma'am, when you do see him, I will ask one thing of you." Della waited. "Do not look at him the way other folks look at him," Wyatt said. "He has had enough of that for one lifetime. Just see him as a man. He is a good one, the best I have ever known." Della did not answer. She did not understand yet. But she nodded because she did not have the strength to do anything else, and the willow bark had begun to pull her down toward sleep. The last thing she remembered before the dark took her again was the sound of an axe biting into wood somewhere outside in the freezing dark. Steady, measured. The slow, patient work of a man who had been swinging that axe for 10 long years and had never once stopped. She did not see Caleb Thorne for 3 days. She heard him. That was the strange thing. She heard the door open and close in the deep blue hour before dawn. She heard the heavy crunch of his boots crossing the floor to the fire, the careful way he laid in fresh wood, the soft creak of the iron hook as he hung a kettle. She heard the low rumble of his voice when he spoke at all, exchanging a few quiet words with Wyatt or Silas before leaving again. But she did not see him. He came in only when she was sleeping or when she had her face turned to the wall, and he left before she could turn back. He slept somewhere else. The barn, Wyatt told her on the second day when she finally asked. "There is a stove out there. He keeps it warm enough. He has slept there since the night we found you, ma'am. He will not come into the cabin while you are awake." "Why?" Della asked. Wyatt did not answer that. He just refilled her cup with broth and looked into the fire for a long moment, and then he said, "My brother does not believe he is fit company for a lady. That is all I will say on it. The rest is his to tell if he ever does." That night, Della lay awake in the cabin while the wind moved against the eaves and she listened to that distant axe falling. Steady, measured. She thought about a man who would sleep in a barn in a Colorado winter, rather than be seen by a woman he had carried out of the snow. She thought about what kind of wound a man would have to carry to live like that. She had been raised in Boston. She had been raised among men who paid for her smile and compliments and gifts and the slick of expensive hair oil. She had been bought in the end by the worst of those men, and here she was on a mountain at the edge of the world being kept alive by three brothers who had not asked for a single thing in return. Not a smile, not a word of thanks, not even the right to look at her. Folk, before we go on, let me tell you something about men like the Thorne brothers. A man keeps his word. That is all there is to it. Out there in those mountains in 1874, a man's word was the only thing standing between him and the long dark of being nothing. A man kept his word, or he was not a man. Caleb Thorne had given his word to himself a long time ago about something, and we are going to find out what it was, and we are going to find out what it cost him, and we are going to find out what it took to make him break it. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight, hit that like button if this story is finding you. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. And let us get back to Cordelia because something is about to happen at that cabin door that no one in the Thorne family is ready for. It happened on the third night. The wind had dropped. The cabin was warm and quiet. Wyatt had gone to his own cabin behind the main house. Silas had gone to the barn to look in on a calf with a colicky belly. Della was alone for the first time sitting up in bed with a bowl of stew in her hands when she heard the front door open. It was not the careful pre-dawn opening she had grown used to. It was a hard, sudden opening. The slam of a man who had not expected anyone to be awake. A man who had reached for the latch out of habit, walked in out of the cold, and then stopped dead in the middle of the room. Della looked up. He filled the doorway. He filled it the way a mountain fills a horizon. He had to bow his head to come in under the lintel, and his shoulders nearly brushed both door frames. He wore a heavy coat of buffalo hide white with snow, and his beard was thick and dark, and his hair fell long around his face. His hands, those enormous scarred hands she remembered, hung at his sides with an axe in one and a bundle of split kindling in the other. He had not expected her to be sitting up. He had not expected her to be awake. He did not move. Neither did she. The fire lit one half of his face, just one half. The half she could see was a hard, handsome face, bearded, weathered, the face of a man chiseled by 10 years of mountain weather, cheekbones like the edge of an axe, a mouth set in a hard line, an eye the color of dark amber, watching her with a stillness that she had never seen on a man before. The other half, the right half, the half he had turned away from her on instinct the moment he understood she could see him, that half was Scar. She caught only a glimpse of it before he moved. A strip of skin along the right jaw and up across the temple that was twisted and shining the way wax cools when it has been melted too hot and poured wrong. A pulled corner of the lip, a line that ran up under the long hair he had grown to cover it. He turned his face into the shadow with an old practiced motion. He had done it 1,000 times. He had done it for 10 years. He set the kindling down by the fire without looking at her. He laid the axe across the hearthstones. He moved to leave. "Wait," Della said. Her voice was hoarse from sleep, but it carried. He stopped at the door. He did not turn around. Folks, a man who has been called a monster for 10 straight years does not turn around when a woman tells him to wait. He braces himself. He waits for the second blow. He waits for the scream or the suie or the polite Boston voice that asks him to please leave the room because his face is not fit for company. That is what Caleb Thorne was waiting for, standing there in his own doorway with his back to a girl from Boston in a borrowed wool shirt. Della spoke again. "You are Caleb," she said. "You are the one who carried me. I owe you my life, sir. I would like to thank you to your face if you will let me." He did not move. "Please," she said. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the soft pop of the fire and the wind moving against the chimney stones. Then slowly, with the same care a man might use in approaching a wounded animal, he did not want to startle Caleb. Thorne turned around. He kept his head bowed. He let his long hair fall the way he always let it fall. The right side of his face stayed in shadow almost, but not entirely. She could see it. He did not hide it as fully as he had a moment before. It was, she understood now, the largest gift he knew how to give. "Thank you," she said. Her voice did not shake. It did not waver. She had been raised a Whitmore, and a Whitmore woman did not flinch. Not at fine men, not at terrible ones, not at the face of a kind man either. "Thank you for finding me," she said. "Thank you for carrying me. Thank you for sleeping in your barn for 3 nights so a stranger could be warm. I do not know how to repay you, but I will not pretend it has not happened." He stared at her. His one good eye, the dark amber one, held hers across the firelight. He did not say you are welcome. He did not say it was nothing. Men like Caleb Thorne do not say those things because to them it is never nothing. What he said was this: "You are awake." "Yes, sir," Della said. "You should be sleeping." "I have been sleeping for 3 days." He was quiet a long moment. "Are you hungry?" he said. Della almost laughed. Almost. Of all the things she had expected the giant to ask, that was not one of them. "I am," she said. "A little." Caleb Thorne nodded very slowly, as if the question had cost him something. Then he crossed the room without looking directly at her again, and he ladled stew from the iron pot at the hearth into a tin bowl, and he set it down on the small wooden stool beside her bed at the very edge of his reach. He stepped back. He kept the right side of his face in the shadow. "Eat," he said, and then he was gone out the door back into the snow before she could say another word. Della sat there in the firelight with the bowl of stew in her hands and the cabin door swinging quietly shut behind him. Her heart was beating fast, faster than it had any right to beat. She did not understand it. She had been raised on poetry. She knew what fear felt like and what relief felt like and what gratitude felt like. This was none of those things. This was something else. This was the first time in her life that a man had walked into a room and treated his own face like a thing to be hidden from her, and her chest had tightened not in disgust, but in something that felt almost like grief. Grief for him, for whatever had been done to him, for whatever he had done to deserve in his own mind the long cold barn instead of the cabin he had built with his own hands. She did not eat the stew right away. She set it aside. She lay back against the firs and she stared up at the rafters and she made herself a quiet promise. She did not yet know what kind of woman she was going to become on this mountain. But she knew with the same certainty she had felt when she stepped off that train that she was not going back. The next 2 days passed in a strange new rhythm. Caleb came in only to lay the morning fire, and he came in only when she had her face turned to the wall. But she knew he was there. She felt him there. She heard the soft, careful weight of him crossing the room. She heard the way he never once let the door bang. She heard the way he spoke to Wyatt and Silas in low, rumbling tones outside the cabin, the way a man speaks when he does not want to disturb a sleeping child. She was not a sleeping child. She was a young woman who had nearly died in his arms and who was beginning very slowly to understand what that meant. On the morning of the 5th day, Wyatt came back from a long ride down off the mountain. He had gone to a settlement at the foot of the ranges called Silver Creek to fetch sugar and a little salt and to listen for any news. He came back with the sugar. He came back with the salt. He came back also with news. He came in stamping snow off his boots. He hung his coat by the door. He looked at Della where she sat on a stool by the fire, her color much better now. Her hair brushed and tied back in a long honey braid. He looked at his brothers, both of them sitting at the table, and he laid a folded paper on the planks between them. A man came into Silver Creek yesterday, Wyatt said. He had 8 riders with him. Hard men, men who had not earned their hardness honestly. He sat in the saloon for 2 hours and he asked the bartender about a young woman. Honey hair, blue eyes, blue silk dress. He said her name was Cordelia. He said she had run from him. He said there was a reward. Della felt the room tilt. How much, Caleb said quietly. He had been silent until then. He had been sitting with his back half turned the way he always sat when she was in the room. But his voice came out now flat and low. $1,000, Wyatt said. Alive. 500 dead. The fire popped in the silence that followed. Caleb stood up. He did not look at Della. He stood with his huge hands flat on the table, and he looked at his brothers, and Della understood then that something had shifted in the cabin. Something had shifted in the mountain. Something had shifted in the air she breathed. The man's name, Caleb said. Reginald Sterling, Wyatt said. Out of Denver, Della's voice when it came sounded very small. He has buried 3 wives, she said. She was looking at the floor. She was looking at the worn boards in front of the hearth. I was meant to be the 4th. I came west on a contract my father signed because he had no other way to keep his church. I jumped from the train 2 miles before Denver because I had been told what happens to the women who marry that man. I did not know. I did not know there were people on this mountain. I did not know any of you. I am sorry I have brought him to your door. She stopped. She had said too much. Whitmore women did not say too much. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Caleb Thorne moved. He moved across the room and he stopped a careful 3 steps from her, and he kept the right side of his face in the half shadow, and he crouched down so that his amber eye was level with hers. Cordelia, he said. Della, she answered, almost a whisper. Most folks call me Della. Della Whitmore, he said. His voice was very low. You did not bring him to my door. He has been coming for someone like you his whole life. Now you listen to me. There are 2 things you can choose tonight. You can saddle up at first light, and one of us will ride you down to the territorial marshal at Silver Creek, and we will tell him what you have told us, and you will be safe under the law. Or you can stay. You can stay on this mountain, and my brothers and I will stand between you and that man for as long as it takes. We will not turn you out. We will not give you up. But the choice has to be yours, and it has to be yours tonight. Della looked at him. She looked at the half of his face that the firelight could touch. She looked at the half that had spent 10 years in shadow. She looked at the way his huge, scarred hands rested on his own knees, as if he did not quite know what to do with them now that they were so close to her. She thought about the 3 dead women. She thought about the train. She thought about her father's church. She thought about a man who had carried her 3 miles through a blizzard and then slept in a barn for 5 nights so she would not feel afraid in his own house. I am staying, she said. Caleb Thorne closed his eyes. Just for a moment, just one long, slow breath. Then he opened them and he nodded once and he stood up to his full, towering height in the firelight. Then we have work to do, he said. And outside somewhere on the long, dark side of the mountain, the wind began to rise. The morning after Della Whitmore made her choice, the snow on Thorn Mountain stopped falling. The sky cleared to a hard, glassy blue, and the sun came up over the ridge with a brightness that hurt the eyes. And Cordelia Whitmore woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the soft sound of 3 men trying very hard not to wake her. She lay still a moment under the firs and listened to them. Wyatt was at the stove, muttering to himself the way men do when they are doing something they are not entirely sure of. Silas was at the table, the soft tap of his knife against a cutting board, slicing something thin and careful. And outside, beyond the heavy cabin door, came the steady fall of an axe. Caleb. He was always swinging that axe. It was the first sound she heard each morning and the last sound she heard each night, the deep, clean rhythm of a man who had decided long ago that work was the only language he could safely speak. Folks, before we go on, let me tell you something about the Thorne brothers and the way they had built their world. 3 men, 1 mountain, 10 years of silence. They had come up there in the autumn of 1864 with everything they owned in a single wagon, and they had not gone back down for any reason but salt and sugar and bullets. They had built that cabin with their own hands, log by log, in the freezing teeth of a Colorado winter. They had buried their mother in the cholera summer of '62 and their father the year after, and Caleb, just past his 19th birthday, when the second grave closed, had raised Wyatt and Silas the rest of the way to manhood by himself. They had not asked the world for anything. The world had not given it to them anyway. And now a Boston girl in a borrowed wool shirt was sitting up in their cabin, and the world, it seemed, had finally come to find them. Della pushed herself upright. Her toes still ached. Her hands were stiff. But the deep cold that had been in her bones for 3 days was gone, and her hair, when she ran her fingers through it, smelled of wood smoke and pine instead of the lavender oil her aunt had used to comb it out in Boston. Wyatt looked up from the stove and grinned at her. He had a face that made grinning look easy, even when he was burning bacon, which he was. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Hope you like your meat black. Caleb says I cook the way a deaf man plays the fiddle, but he is the one who keeps making me do it." Della smiled. It was the first real smile she had given in a long time. It felt strange on her face. "I will eat anything you put in front of me, Mr. Thorne," she said. Wyatt waved a fork at her. "Wyatt, ma'am. Just Wyatt. Mr. Thorne is my brother, and he is a sour old goat, so do not waste the title on him." Silas at the table did not look up from his cutting board, but the corner of his mouth turned up just a little. It was, Della would learn, as close to a laugh as Silas Thorne ever came. She stood up slowly, her legs held. She crossed to the table on bare feet, wrapped in clean linen bandages, and Silas, without saying a word, pulled out a chair for her and went back to his work. After breakfast, Caleb came in. He came in the way he always came in now. He stamped his boots on the porch first. He paused at the threshold. He did not look at her directly. He took his hat off as he ducked under the lintel, and he kept the right side of his face turned partway into the shadow of his long dark hair. He stood there a moment, hat in his hands, the giant of the doorway, and he spoke without quite meeting her eyes. "We need to talk," he said, "about how this is going to work." Della folded her hands in her lap. "Yes," she said. He sat down, not at the table. He pulled a stool to the far side of the room by the wood box, and he sat with his huge frame hunched forward and his elbows on his knees and the brim of his hat turning slow in his hands. "This is the way of it," he said. "You take the cabin. The bed is yours. We have linens in the trunk by the door if you need more. Wyatt and Silas have their own cabins out back beyond the smokehouse. They built them 3 years ago when they got tired of my snoring." A small, dry sound from Silas at the table. A laugh almost. Caleb went on. I will sleep in the barn. There is a stove out there. I will keep it warm enough. I have done it before. Do not worry about me. Della opened her mouth. I am not finished, he said. Not unkind, just steady. She closed her mouth. You cook when you are well enough, he said. We will hunt. We will tend the stock. You will not want for food, and you will not want for fire. Sterling will not find this mountain. He may try. He may send men. But the trail to this cabin is not on any map I have ever seen, and I aim to keep it that way. Come spring when the pass clears, you can go where you like. Down to Fort Collins, back east if that is what you want. We will take you. We will see you safe. There is no obligation here. There is no contract. You owe us nothing. Are we understood? Della looked at him. She looked at the half of his face she could see. She looked at the careful distance he had set between his stool and her chair, the careful distance he had set between his life and hers, and she understood with a small ache she had not expected what he was doing. He was making sure she knew he was not Reginald Sterling. He was not buying her. He was not even keeping her. He was simply offering her a winter of breath and a spring of choosing and asking nothing back. Yes, sir, she said softly. We are understood, and thank you. Caleb nodded once. He stood up. He turned to leave. But Mr. Thorne, she said. He paused. His hand was on the door. I do not just cook, she said. I read. I write a fine hand. I know my numbers and my Latin and my scripture, for what little those are worth out here. I am stronger than I look. I have nearly died once already this week, and I am still here. I will not be a burden on you. I will earn my keep on this mountain. That is the bargain I offer if you will take it. Caleb Thorne stood with his back to her, the great wide span of his buffalo coat blocking the morning light from the doorway, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very low, I will take it, Miss Whitmore. And he stepped out into the snow. The first week she did small things. She had to. Her feet still ached, her hands still trembled with the long cold. And Silas had told her plainly that if she pushed too fast, the frostbite would come back and take her toes for good. So she stayed close to the fire. She mended Wyatt's torn shirt with thread from the sewing tin she found in a drawer beside the cot. She kneaded bread dough on the rough plank table, and the warm, yeasty smell of it filled the cabin so completely that Wyatt walked in once stopped, closed his eyes and said, Lord, it smells like a home in here. That was the first time she understood that none of them remembered any more what a home was meant to smell like. Caleb did not eat with them. He took his plate at the door where Silas would set it on the bench beside his coat, and he carried it out to the barn, and he ate alone with the horses and the stove and the wind. He came in only to bring wood to check the fire, to ask Silas a question in his low rumbling voice. He never sat at the table while Della was at it. He never let his eyes rest on her face for more than a heartbeat at a time. But she felt him. All day, every day, she felt him. The way you feel the sun behind a cloud. Always there, never quite seen. By the start of the second week, she was strong enough to walk. Wyatt took her out first. He bundled her in a heavy buffalo coat that had belonged to his father and a pair of fur-lined boots that Silas had cut down for her smaller foot, and he led her out into the snow behind the barn where the trees thinned and the ground rose toward a long ridge of pines. He carried his rifle slung over his back. He kept his pace slow. Watch the snow, Wyatt said, not your feet. The snow tells you everything about a country you are walking in. See there. You see those small prints, almost like a child's hand, 4 toes and a long heel. That is a snowshoe hare. We had 3 of them around the cabin last night. Silas will have us in rabbit stew tomorrow if I can find them in daylight. Now look there. See those big round ones, deeper, no claws. That is a mountain lion. He came through about an hour before dawn. He is a mile off by now. He will not bother us. Della listened. She had read a great many books in her life, but she had never read a book that taught a woman to look at the ground the way Wyatt Thorne was teaching her to look at it now. She had been raised to look up, to look at faces, to look at chandeliers and sermons and pages. She had not been raised to look down at a square foot of snow and see in it the entire honest history of a winter night. You learn to read the ground, ma'am, Wyatt said, and a country like this stops being a stranger to you. It starts telling you its name. She kept her eyes on the snow. She did not say anything for a long while. Then she said quietly, "Why do you call me Ma'am Wyatt? I am younger than you." Wyatt smiled his easy smile, his eyes bright in the cold. "Because my brother Caleb said you were a lady, ma'am," he said. "And what Caleb says in this family, that is what is so." Silas was different. He did not take her out into the country. He took her into his small storeroom at the back of the cabin, where bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters in tied sheaves and clay jars sat in rows on a long shelf he had built himself. He showed her willow bark gray and curling. He showed her yarrow dried to a small, pale flower. He showed her sage and mint and a dark, leathery leaf he called bear's claw that he said could pull a fever down out of a child in one long night. "I learned this from a Scottish widow," he said quietly, "Mrs. Wilhelmina Hartwell. Her husband was a botanist out of Edinburgh who came west to study American plants and died of a snake bite a year after he got here. She stayed. She lived in a sod house a day's ride from this mountain for 37 years. She taught me every leaf for 10 miles in any direction. She died last spring. I buried her myself because there was no one else." Della looked at his hands. They were younger hands than Caleb's, less scarred, but they were the hands of a man who had buried someone he loved with no help and no service. And she understood without him saying it that Silas Thorne was a man who carried a great deal of quiet sorrow inside a very small room. "Will you teach me?" she said. He looked up at her, surprised. "I have nothing to do with my hands," she said. "I would like to learn something useful." Silas Thorne, who had not smiled all week, smiled then. Not with his mouth, with his eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I will." And Caleb. Caleb, who had spoken to her exactly 4 times in 7 days. It was Wyatt who finally pushed it. On the morning of the 8th day, Wyatt came in stamping his boots and announced loud enough for the whole mountain that he and Silas had business at the trap line on the north slope and would be gone until late afternoon, and that Caleb would have to be the one to teach Miss Whitmore how to chop wood since she had asked the night before to learn. And a thorn said Wyatt did not break his word to a lady. Caleb, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, looked up at his brother in a way that Della understood would have killed a smaller man on the spot. Wyatt grinned. He picked up his rifle. He clapped Silas on the shoulder, and Silas, the quiet one, gave Della a look that was almost wicked, and then both of them were out the door before Caleb could find a reason to stop them. The cabin went very quiet. Caleb did not look at her. He sat at the table for a long moment with his huge hands wrapped around his tin cup, and the steam from his coffee rose up between them, and finally he set the cup down very slowly and stood up. "Bundle up," he said, without looking at her. "Boots, Wyatt's old gloves, the small ones in the trunk. I will be at the wood pile." She bundled up. She went out. He was waiting by the chopping block, an axe in his hand. The block was a great rounded slab of pine taller than her knees, ringed with the hatchet scars of 10 years of work. A second axe leaned against it, smaller, lighter, made for someone with smaller hands. He had set it out for her. He had been thinking about this. He had been planning how to do this, how to be near her in daylight, how to teach her without breaking the careful, careful distance he had set between them. She saw it in the way he had laid that lighter axe out, blade up, handle clean. "Step here," he said. He pointed to a packed place in the snow 10 feet from the block. "You stand back. You do not stand close. An axe glances sometimes. You do not want to be where it goes." "Yes, sir," she said. He set a round of pine on the block. He raised his own axe. He brought it down. The round split clean in half with a sound like a rifle shot, and Della jumped, and Caleb, the huge man, almost smiled. She saw it. The corner of his mouth, the side she could see lifted. just for a heartbeat. It is the wood that does the work, he said, not your arms. You let the weight of the axe carry it. You let the wood show you the line. Watch. He set another round. He brought the axe down. Split. Another. Split. She watched him. She could not help it. She watched the way his shoulders moved under the buffalo coat. She watched the easy economy of his hands she had thought on the night he carried her were the hands of something dangerous. They were not. They were the hands of a craftsman. They had shaped this whole cabin out of the side of a mountain. They had buried his parents. They had raised his brothers. They had carried her 3 miles through a blizzard. He saw her watching. He looked away fast. You try, he said. She tried. Her first swing went wild and the axe head bounced off the round and stuck in the snow, and Della almost cried out from the shock of it traveling up her arms. She felt foolish. She felt soft. She felt every Boston parlor she had ever sat in. Caleb walked over. He did not take her hands in his. He did not even come close. He stood 3 careful feet away, and he raised his own axe slowly, and he showed her with his own body the way it was meant to move. Feet here, he said, wider. Plant them. Let the axe come up over your shoulder. Do not lift it, let it ride. Now bring it down. Do not aim for the wood, aim for the block under it. Trust the wood to break. She tried again. The axe came down, and the round this time gave a small split down its middle, and Della laughed out loud, a clear, bright sound that rang off the cabin wall and the trees. Caleb Thorne stopped breathing for a moment. He stood there in the snow with his own axe loose in his hand, and he watched a young woman in his brother's old buffalo coat laugh at a half-split piece of pine, and something happened inside the man's chest that he had not allowed to happen in 10 long years. He turned away fast. He cleared his throat. Again he said gruffly, "Do it again." You almost had it. She did. She split the next one clean through. By the end of the morning, she had split 11 rounds. By the end of the week, she could split 40. And every afternoon after the work was done, she felt his eyes on her from the barn door or the corner of the cabin. Not staring, not the way men in Boston had stared, just watching. The way a man watches a slow snow falling when he has been alone in a winter for 10 years and does not know anymore what else to do with his hands. It happened in the middle of the 3rd week. She had taken to splitting wood every morning before breakfast because Silas said the work would bring the strength back into her hands. She was alone at the block. The brothers were out at the south fence mending a wire that the elk had pushed through in the night. The cabin was quiet. The sun was just up. She sat around on the block. She raised the axe. She brought it down. The handle, weather-worn, gave way at the throat. The axe head spun loose. Della tried to twist clear, but her boots slipped on a patch of ice, and the axe head came down and clipped the back of her left hand on its way past, and she went down hard in the snow with a sharp red line opening across her knuckles. She did not cry out. Whitmore women did not cry out. She sat in the snow and stared at the blood pooling in her glove, and she thought oddly that her father would be horrified. Caleb came running. He came running across the open ground from the south fence with a speed that should not have been possible for a man so big, and he was at her side and on his knees in the snow before she could even think to stand. "Let me see," he said. His voice was rough. "Della, let me see." It was the first time he had used her name. She lifted her hand. He took it. His huge, scarred hand closed around her small, bloody one with a gentleness she would not have believed possible if she had not felt it, and he turned her hand toward the morning light, and she saw his amber eye go narrow and steady, the way a man's eye goes steady when he is reading damage. "It is not deep," he said. Glanced. "You will keep your fingers, but it needs to be cleaned and bound. Now." He pulled her up to her feet without effort. He kept her hand in his pressed against his own chest, against the heavy wool of his shirt to keep it raised above her heart. And then, folks, then she did the thing. Caleb Thorne had spent 10 years arranging his life so that no one would ever look directly at the right side of his face in clear daylight. He had grown the beard. He had grown the hair long. He had learned to walk with his right side angled away from any open door. He had done it so well for so long that he had almost forgotten the scar was there. But Della Whitmore, with her left hand bleeding into her glove and her right hand free, reached up, slowly, carefully, the way Silas had taught her to approach a frightened deer. She brushed a strand of his long, dark hair back from his face. She did it without thinking. She did it the way a woman tucks back a child's hair to look at a bruise. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not avert her eyes. She simply moved the curtain of his hair aside, and she looked at the ruined half of Caleb Thorne's face in the full, clean morning light of a Colorado winter. And she said very softly, "Thank you for running." He could not speak. He stood there with his huge hands wrapped around hers and his face fully revealed for the first time in 10 years to a woman not his blood, and his amber eye, the one she could see, went very bright and very wet. And he turned his head away fast and breathed in once hard through his nose. Inside, he said, his voice ragged, "Now, before it stiffens up." He led her in by the wrist. He cleaned the cut himself. Silas's herbs, Silas's clean linen. His huge fingers moved with a delicacy that did not match his size, and Della watched him work, and she did not look away from his face because she had decided in the snow that she was not going to look away from his face anymore. There, he said when the bandage was tied, "Keep it dry. Silas will look at it tonight. You will be sore a few days. You will not split wood with that hand for a week." "Yes, sir," she said. "Della." She looked up. "Do not call me sir." "What should I call you?" she said. He hesitated. Then he said, very quiet, "My name will do." "Caleb," she said. It was the first time. He closed his eyes just for a heartbeat, the way a man closes his eyes against a kindness he has not earned. And then he stepped back, and he was Caleb Thorne again, big and silent, and turning toward the door, and he was gone out into the snow. That night after supper, after Wyatt and Silas had gone to their own cabins, and the wind had dropped to a long, low whisper around the eaves, Della sat by the fire with a tin cup of black coffee in her good hand, and she heard Caleb come back in. He stamped his boots on the porch. He paused the way he always paused. But this time he did not retreat. This time he came in. He hung his coat. He hung his hat. He sat down at the far end of the long pine table with the lamp between them, and he took a deep breath, the way a man takes a breath before he goes underwater. "I think I owe you the rest of the story," he said. About the face, Della set down her cup. "You do not owe me anything, Caleb." "Maybe not," he said, "but I owe it to myself. I have not told it in 10 years. I think tonight is the night I find out if I still can." The fire cracked between them. The wind moved. Folks, hit the like button if you have stayed with us this far. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. I'm about to tell you the story of how Caleb Thorne lost half his face and the woman he was meant to marry in a single afternoon in 1864, and I want you riding this campfire with me when I do. His name was Ezekiel, Caleb said. Folks called him Zeke. He was 8 years old. He was the nephew of the man who owned the foundry where I worked in Pueblo in the spring of '64. His father was dead. His mother worked in the office. He used to come down to the floor to watch us pour the iron, and we would let him because he was a quiet child and he had no friends. I was 20 years old. I was the strongest man on the floor. They said so. I had been a blacksmith since I was 14, and my hands had been shaped by 10,000 swings of the hammer. I was engaged then to a woman named Adelaide Pemberton, the owner's daughter. She was Zeke's older cousin. She loved me, I think, as much as a woman like that could love a man like me. We were to be married that June. The coal hopper caught on a Wednesday afternoon. I do not know how. They never did find out how. I just remember the sound, like the world inhaling. Then the roof beams started coming down and the iron in the crucibles was full and the men were running and I turned to run with them, and then I saw the boy. He was behind the bellows. He had hidden when the noise started. He was 8 years old. He could not get out. I went back. I did not think about it. I just went back. I covered him with my body when the beams came down. The molten iron, when the crucibles tipped, came over the lip of the bellows like a slow red rain, and I felt it on my face and my shoulder and my arm, and I held the boy under me, and I prayed he would live. He lived. He did not have a mark on him. I woke up in a bed 2 weeks later. They said I would not see again from the right eye. That came back mostly. They said I would not speak. That came back too. They said the burns would heal. They did after a fashion. I had a face still, just not the one I had gone in with. Adelaide came to see me on the 15th day. He paused. He was looking at the table, not at her. She came into the room. She looked at me. She fainted in the doorway. They had to carry her out. When she was well enough to come back 2 days later, she could not look at me. She tried. She could not. She gave the ring back to her mother to give to me because she said she could not bear to put it in my hand herself. She was not a cruel woman. She was just a young one. She had not been raised for a face like the one I had now. I do not blame her. I have never blamed her. I hope she is happy somewhere. Zeke's mother came too. She came to thank me. She brought the boy. She held him in the doorway, and she looked at me and she said, "Please understand, I cannot let him near you. He is a child. He will dream of your face in the dark. I cannot do that to him. Please understand." Caleb's voice was very steady. He had told this part to himself many nights over many years. He had worn the word smooth. I left Pueblo 3 weeks later, he said. Wyatt was 17. Silas was 14. Our mother had been dead 2 years and our father 1. I packed a wagon and I brought my brothers up onto this mountain, and I have not been back to a town larger than Silver Creek in 10 years. He looked up at her finally, the amber eye in the firelight. That is the story, Della. That is what I am. The world looked at me one time and decided what it had decided, and I have not given the world a second chance to look since. That is why I sleep in the barn. That is why I keep my face turned away from yours. Not because I think you are like Adelaide, not because I think you would faint, but because I do not want to find out. I have built a quiet life out of not finding out. Do you understand? Della Whitmore reached across the table. She did not stand up. She did not make a scene. She simply reached across the long pine table past the lamp, and she put her small bandaged hand on top of his huge scarred one, and she said, "Caleb Thorne, the world did not look at you. It looked at a wound. You are not a wound. You are the man who carried me through a blizzard. You are the man who taught me to split wood. You are the man who has kept the right side of his face out of my sight for 3 weeks because he would rather suffer alone than ask a stranger to suffer with him. There is no wound in this room. There is only a man, and I am looking at him." He did not answer. He did not have to. His huge hand turned slowly under hers, and his fingers closed once around her bandaged ones, and he held her hand for a long, quiet moment in the lamplight. Then he let go. He stood up. He walked to the door. He paused at the threshold the way he always paused. "Good night, Della," he said. "Good night, Caleb," she said. He went out. The door closed soft behind him. The fire popped. The wind moved against the chimney. But this time Della did not hear his boots crunching out toward the barn. This time she heard them stop just past the door on the porch. And she heard him stand there a long, long moment in the freezing, dark breathing. The next morning she came out at first light to find that Caleb had already laid the cabin fire from inside. He had come in while she slept. He had come into his own house for the first time in 3 weeks. He had not gone back to the barn that night. A change had come on the mountain. Folks could feel it in the way the brothers moved around each other. Wyatt teased Caleb at supper now openly, and Caleb let him. Silas began leaving small things for Della on the table. A pressed sprig of yarrow, a polished river stone, a small wooden comb he had carved one quiet evening from a piece of cedar. And Caleb. Caleb sat at the table with them now. He did not eat in the barn anymore. He sat at the far end where the lamp threw the most shadow on the right side of his face, but he sat. He answered when she spoke. He even once told a story about the time Wyatt had been treed by a black bear at age 12 and had cried so loudly the bear had wandered off in disgust. Wyatt protested. Silas laughed out loud, the first laugh she had ever heard from him, a low, warm sound, and Della laughed with them, and the cabin filled that night with something it had not held in 10 years. It filled with the sound of a family. There was one more morning before the second poster came. One quiet morning that Della would remember for the rest of her long life. She woke before the men. She found Caleb sitting alone by the dying fire with a small steel knife in his hand and a hand mirror on his knee, trying to cut his own beard back with the patience of a man doing surgery on himself in the dark. He had nicked his cheek twice. There was a small smear of blood on his collar. Della watched him a moment. Then she walked across the cabin in her bare feet and sat down on the stool in front of him. "Give me the knife," she said. He did not. "Caleb Thorne," she said quietly, "you have let me into every other part of this cabin. Let me into this one, too." He looked at her a long moment in the firelight. Then he reached behind himself on the table, and he handed her her own small sewing scissors instead. Steel, sharp, the pair she had been mending Wyatt's shirts with for 3 weeks. She took them. She stood up. She stepped between his knees. The closeness of it was a thing he had not allowed in 10 years, and he held himself very still under it, the way a man holds himself still when a deer is feeding 3 feet from his hand. She began with the beard. She trimmed it back slowly, careful around the pulled corner of his mouth where the scar tissue ran. She did not avoid that corner. She let her fingers rest there as she worked the cool tips of them, tracing the line where the smooth skin gave way to the rough, and she did not flinch, and she did not pause, and she did not say anything. Then she went to the hair. She cut the long dark curtain back behind his ears, the way she would have cut her own brother's hair, if she had ever had a brother. She cut the front shorter off his brow. The scarred temple came clear in the firelight. She let her fingers trace that line too, the place where the burn had pulled the hair root out for good and would not let it grow again. She did not pull her hand away. "There," she said softly when she was done. "There you are." He stood up slowly. He went to the small mirror Silas kept above the wash basin. He looked. He had not looked in 10 years. He had over time stopped owning a mirror in any room he slept in. The face that looked back at him now was not the face he had carried into the foundry in 1864, but it was not anymore the face of a man hiding behind his own hair somewhere either. It was the face of a man. That was all. A man. He stood at the basin a long while in the firelight. Then he turned around and he looked at Della and he said very low, "I have not let anyone see me by daylight in 10 years. I do not know how to thank you for that." "You do not have to," she said. "You only have to let me do it again next month." He almost smiled. He almost did. Folks, that was the last quiet morning the Thorne cabin had for a while. 2 days later, Wyatt came in hard from the trap line, and the world Sterling had built came up the southern trail looking for the woman he had bought. And the 7 days that followed were the 7 days that decided the rest of every life on Thorn Mountain. Wyatt rode in from the trap line at a hard gallop. He came off his horse before it had stopped. His face was pale under the windburn. He came through the cabin door without stamping his boots, without taking off his hat, and he laid a folded piece of paper on the table in front of his older brother. "Caleb," he said, "they are at Silver Creek, Sterling. He has 8 men. He came in last night. He has put up a poster on every wall in the saloon. He has raised the bounty, 5,000 alive, 2,000 dead, and he is not waiting in town. He is sending men into the hills. He has given them 7 days." The cabin went very still. Caleb picked up the paper. He read it once. He set it down. He looked across the table at Della Whitmore. The firelight caught the right side of his face, and for the first time he did not turn away from it. He let her see him. He let her see all of him. The man who had been told what he was worth by a town that could not look at him, and the man who had decided sometime in the night to be worth something different. "Della," he said, "the choice you made stands. but the cost has just gone up. Della Whitmore stood up from her chair at the long pine table. Then we have work to do, she said. The 7 days began that morning. Caleb Thorne stood at the long pine table with the folded poster in front of him, and he laid out the work the way a general lays out a battle, except this was not a battle yet. Not quite. This was the work of getting ready for one. And folks, if you have ever known a man who has spent 10 years preparing for a fight he never expected to need, then you know how Caleb Thorne moved that morning. Slow, steady, saying nothing twice. Wyatt would ride the South Ridge twice a day. Sterling's men would come up from the south because the North Pass was already choked with snow, and no rider out of Silver Creek would know any other way. Wyatt would set snare wires on the lower trails. Wyatt would set bear traps on the wider passes, the kind that caught a horse's leg, not a man's, because Caleb Thorne, even now, was not the kind of man who set out to take a life if there was another way. Silas would lay in food and ammunition. He would also pack a small leather satchel of medical supplies and ride down off the mountain alone to fetch quinine sulfate and morphine and clean linen from the doctor at Silver Creek. There was no other way. Silas was the only one of the brothers whose face was not yet known to Sterling's men. Caleb's face was a face you described in one sentence and never forgot. Wyatt was tall and bright-haired and easy to spot on any street. Silas was the quiet one. Silas could ride into a town and ride out again, and no one would remember he had been there. Caleb himself would stay at the cabin. He would mind Della. He would lay in firewood enough for a long siege. He would sight in the long Sharps rifle that hung above the door, the one he had not fired in 4 years, the one he had told himself was only there for memory. Memory, it turned out, was about to become something else. And Della would learn to shoot. She had asked. The night the second poster came after Wyatt had gone back to his own cabin and Silas had banked the fire low, Della had stood up from her chair and she had looked at Caleb across the lamplight and she had said, "I want a rifle. I will not sit in this cabin while you three stand outside it. If they come, I will stand with you. Teach me to shoot." Caleb had looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he had nodded. So in the cold, pale mornings of those 7 days, while Wyatt rode the ridges and Silas packed the satchels, Caleb took Della Whitmore out behind the smokehouse with a small Henry, repeating rifle and a row of tin cans set on a fence rail 40 yards off, and he taught a Boston preacher's daughter how to break a man's life at distance. She was not good at first. The recoil bruised her shoulder through 3 layers of wool. The lever stuck under her small fingers. She missed every can on the first morning, and she missed every can on the second, and she came back into the cabin with her eyes hot and her mouth set, and Caleb said, "Only you will hit one tomorrow." She did. On the third morning, the third can went down, and Della Whitmore let out a small, fierce sound that was not a laugh, but was close to one, and Caleb, watching her from 3 steps behind, said to himself very quietly, "This woman is not what I thought she was." She had not been, of course. She never had been. He had thought on the night he carried her out of the snow that he was carrying a fragile thing, a silk dress thing, a Boston thing. He had been wrong. Cordelia Whitmore had been a hard kernel of will inside a soft shell from the day her mother died, and the mountain, instead of breaking her, had simply cracked the shell off. And what stood at the fence rail with the Henry rifle on the third morning was the woman she had always meant to be. By the 5th day, she could put 4 cans down out of 6. By the 7th, she could put all 6 down twice in a row. That was the morning Silas left for Silver Creek. He went out before dawn. He took the older bay mare, the slow, patient one, who would not spook at gunshot, and he took the long way, the trail Caleb had cut himself the first winter on the mountain, the one that did not show on any map. He had a list folded inside his coat in Della's careful schoolhouse hand. Quinine sulfate, morphine, 200 rounds of .44 caliber cartridge, a small bottle of laudanum, the kind Silas hated to use but knew in a real wound was sometimes the only kindness left. A pound of coffee, because Wyatt had said with a grin that if they were going to die for a Boston girl, He would like to die awake. Silas hugged Della at the door, which was not his way, and he said only 3 days. Tell my brothers to stop scowling while I am gone. Then he was gone, and the cabin was quieter than it had ever been. That was the day Della Whitmore got sick. It came on her in the afternoon. A small ache behind the eyes, a flush in the cheeks that at first Caleb mistook for the cold. By supper time she could not eat. By midnight she was burning. By the dawn of the second day after Silas left, she lay in the cot under 3 furs and could not lift her head, and her honey hair was dark and damp at the temples, and she was speaking in her sleep to her mother in Boston, who had been dead 14 years. Caleb Thorne sat by the cot. Wyatt came in. He looked once at her. He looked at his brother. Typhoid, Wyatt said quietly. Got to be. Same fever the Carlson family had 2 winters ago down at Silver Creek. They lost the youngest girl. Caleb did not answer. How long until Silas, Wyatt said. 2 more days, Caleb said. If he rides hard, 3 if the weather turns. She does not have 3 days, Wyatt said. Caleb looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Caleb. Folks, there is a kind of look that passes between brothers who have lived alone on a mountain for 10 years, who have buried their parents and raised each other, and it does not need words. Wyatt nodded once and went out and saddled the second horse, and Caleb knew without being told that Wyatt was going to ride the southern trail at a flat run to meet Silas coming back to cut a day off his return, and Caleb was going to stay with Della and keep her alive until the medicine came. He stayed 5 days. He did not sleep in the barn. He did not sleep at all, not really. He sat on the low stool beside her cot in the firelight, and he wrung out cloths in Coal Creek water, and he laid them across her forehead, and he changed them every 10 minutes all night. Every night, he spooned willow bark tea between her cracked lips. He held her up against his shoulder when the fever made her shake and shake until her teeth chattered, and he held her down gently when the fever made her thrash. He did all of this with his huge scarred hands, the hands the world had told him were too rough to ever touch a woman in tenderness, and he did it without flinching and without resting and without speaking. On the second night, she opened her eyes. She looked up at him in the lamplight. She did not seem to know where she was. The fever was riding her hard. Her cornflower blue eyes were glassy. But she saw him. Caleb, she said. I am here, he said. Caleb, do not go. Do not go anywhere. You are home. You are my home. He could not answer. He bent his head down over hers and he laid a small, careful kiss on her forehead, the way a man kisses a sleeping child, and one slow tear ran down the scarred side of his face and fell into her hair, and he said very low, where only she would have heard it if she had been hearing, I am here, Della. I am not leaving. Winter always ends. You hear me. Winter always ends. She slipped back into the dark. It was on the 3rd night that Silas came back. He came back wrong. That was the first thing Caleb knew when he heard the hooves coming up the ridge in the dark, and he heard the horse coming hard but uneven, and he heard a man's weight in the saddle that was not riding right. Caleb stood up from Della's cot. He took the long sharps off the wall. He went out. It was Silas. It was the bay mare, and Silas was bleeding. He got off the horse the way a man gets off a horse when he is not sure he can stand slow, with one hand white on the saddle horn and the other pressed flat against his thigh. The thigh was dark. The whole leg of his trousers was dark. He had been bleeding for hours. I have it, Silas said. The medicine. All of it. It is in the saddlebag. They got me a mile past the Painted Rock. 2 of them. Sterling's men. I do not know how they found that trail. I killed one. The other rode east. I do not think he made it back. I rode through the creek to throw the trail. Caleb, the medicine. Get it to her, now. Caleb caught his brother under the arms as Silas's knees gave out. He carried him into the cabin the way he had once carried Della Easy Careful Large. Wyatt, who had been at his cabin behind the smokehouse, came running at the noise. His face went pale when he saw Silas. He did not say a word. He went straight to the satchel. He pulled out the quinine first. He brought it to the cot where Della lay burning, and Caleb mixed the powder with water in a tin cup. And Wyatt held her head up while Caleb poured the bitter draught between her lips. Then they turned to Silas. Silas was sitting in a chair by the fire with his hands flat on his knees. He had pulled his trouser leg up. The wound was high in the thigh just below the joint, and it was a bullet wound, and the bullet had gone clean through, which was the only piece of luck in the whole hard night. Caleb cleaned it. Wyatt threaded the needle. Silas, who had stitched 100 wounds on other men, sat very still while his brother stitched him, and he did not make a sound, but the muscles in his jaw stood out like cords. When it was done, Silas looked up at Caleb. "He is coming," Silas said. "Sterling. He left Silver Creek the morning I rode out. He has 8 men with him. He told the bartender he was going to take the mountain apart log by log. He did not say the word reward anymore. He said the words, 'The woman is mine.'" Caleb stood very still in the firelight. "How many days?" he said. "2," Silas said. "Maybe 3. He is coming up the southern trail." Caleb nodded once. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Silas. He looked at the cot where Della lay burning the quinine, just beginning very slowly to do its work. And then he did something that none of his brothers had ever seen him do, not in 10 years, not in the cabin, not in the barn, not on the mountain. He stood in the middle of the room in the firelight with his huge scarred hands hanging at his sides, and he turned his face fully into the light. The right side, the ruined side, the side he had spent 10 long years keeping in the shadow. He let his brothers look at him. "I have hidden long enough," he said. "I am done hiding. They can come for her. They will not find her. They will find me. And what they find, they will not forget." Silas in his chair made a small sound in his throat. Pride. Grief. Something between. Wyatt nodded slow. "Then we hold the cabin," Wyatt said. "Then we hold the cabin," Caleb said. She came up out of the fever on the morning of the second day after Silas got back. The quinine had done its work. Her color had come back. Her eyes, when she opened them, were clear. She was weak. She was thin. But she was there. She looked at Caleb, who was sitting on the low stool beside her cot where he had been sitting for 5 days, and her chapped lips moved into a small, dry smile. "You did not sleep," she said. "I slept some," he said. "You did not." "I might have lied a little." She laughed. It was a small sound. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. She was strong enough by supper time to sit up against the wall and eat a bowl of broth. She was strong enough by the next morning to stand. By that afternoon, when Wyatt told her plainly what was coming up the southern trail, she was strong enough to look across the cabin at Caleb Thorne and say, "I can hold a rifle. I am not staying in the back room," Della Caleb said. I'm not staying in the back room," she said again. "I have not come this far to be hidden. If they come up that trail, they come up it for me, and I will look them in the face when they do. That is the bargain I am offering. Take it, Caleb Thorne, or do not." He took it. The night before Sterling came, the wind dropped to nothing. The sky cleared. The stars came out so thick over Thorn Mountain that you could read your own hand by them, and it was that kind of cold that made the snow squeak under your boots like a child's voice. Silas was asleep in his chair by the fire. The wound had taken a great deal of him, and Della had finally gently put a tin cup of laudanum tea into his hand and not let him refuse it. Wyatt was at the south fence one last time, walking the line and checking the snares. The cabin was quiet. Caleb sat on the long porch with the Sharps rifle across his knees. Della came out wrapped in a buffalo coat, and she sat down beside him without a word. And she did not sit at the careful 3-foot distance he had taught himself all those weeks ago was the proper distance for a man like him to keep from a woman like her. She sat close, her shoulder against his shoulder, her honey hair against the rough wool of his collar, the small, steady weight of her leaning into the side of him. He did not move away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb Thorne, who had not given a speech in his life, spoke. "I am not a man who knows how to say things," he said. His voice was very low. It seemed almost to come out of the ground. So I will say what I can. Della Whitmore. I have lived 10 years on this mountain alone in my own head, and I had decided a long time ago that no woman would ever look at me again the way Adelaide looked at me on that 15th day. I had made my peace with it. I had built a life out of not asking. And then a girl in a blue silk dress jumped off a train 2 miles short of Denver, and she walked into the wrong woods, and I carried her 3 miles through a blizzard, and I told myself I was carrying a stranger. I was lying to myself. Even then, I was lying to myself. I love you, Della. I have loved you, I think, since the night Wyatt asked me to teach you to chop wood. And I sat at the table and I knew I had been waiting all my life to teach somebody to chop wood. I am not asking you to love me back. A man like me does not ask things like that of a woman like you. I am only telling you because tomorrow, 8 men are going to come up that southern trail, and I might not have another chance to say it, and I will not die with it sitting unsaid in my mouth. That is all I have to say. Della Whitmore did not answer with words. She did not stand up either. She turned her face into the rough wool of his collar against the place where his pulse beat steady and slow under his beard, and she stayed there a long, quiet moment, and then she said against the warm wool of him, I have loved one man in my life, Caleb Thorne. It is you. It will always be you. I did not know your name when I jumped off that train. I know your name now. I am not leaving this mountain. I am not leaving this porch. Tomorrow, if 8 men come up that trail, they will come up it through me and through you, and we will hold this cabin together, and we will see what is left of us by sundown. He turned his face. She turned hers. Their lips met once very gentle in the starlight on the porch of a cabin he had built with his own hands 10 years before. It was a kiss, like a vow. There was nothing hurried in it, and nothing taken, and nothing promised that had not already been earned. When it ended, Caleb pressed his forehead to hers, and his huge scarred hand cupped the back of her head, and he held her there a long moment in the freezing cold, while their breath rose between them in small white plumes. Winter always ends, Della Whitmore, he said very low. Yes, she said, it does. The door opened behind them. Wyatt stood there, his rifle slung, his hat in his hand. He did not say a word. He looked at the two of them on the porch, and a small, slow smile moved across his face, and he closed the door again with great delicacy, and they heard him laugh once, soft on the other side. Sterling came at high noon. He came up the southern trail with 8 riders behind him, exactly as Wyatt had said he would. The bear trap on the wide pass took the first horse out of the line. The animal went down screaming, and the man on its back rolled clear and broke his arm on a rock, and the column slowed and bunched, and Wyatt from the high pine on the ridge took a second man clean out of the saddle with the Henry rifle at 300 yards. Sterling's men scattered into the rocks. They began their advance on foot. Caleb stood at the cabin door with the Sharps. Della was inside the cabin at the loophole on the south wall, the Henry across her arms. Silas, who could not stand long on the wounded leg, was at the loophole on the east wall, propped on a stool, his old Spencer rifle in his hands. The fight came up to the cabin in pieces. 2 more men went down to Wyatt's rifle from the ridge, 3 in all by then counting the rider he had taken out of the saddle first. 1 went down to a bear trap on the upper trail, the one Caleb had set himself the night before. 2 more came up from the back of the cabin where the smokehouse was, and Silas from the east loophole dropped them both at 30 yards before they ever saw him. That left Sterling, and 1 man with him, the cold blood man, the hired one, the one folks down at Silver Creek had whispered about. They came out of the trees together at the open ground in front of the cabin. They had a torch. Sterling held it up, and he shouted in a voice that did not sound any more like a banker. Cordelia, come out, or I burn this cabin to the ground with you in it. Inside, Della stood at the loophole. Her hands were steady. The Henry was at her shoulder. She did not come out. Sterling threw the torch. The torch hit the porch roof, and the dry shake shingles took the flame, and within 30 seconds, half the front of the cabin was on fire. Caleb felt the heat hit him through the door. And folks, he froze. He froze the way a man freezes when he has seen this fire before. 10 years. 10 years of work to bury what had happened in Pueblo, and the smell of pitch pine burning brought it back in a single breath. And Caleb Thorne stood in his own doorway with the sharps in his hand and the molten iron raining down again across his memory, and he could not move. Della saw it. She came out of the cabin behind him. She was supposed to stay inside. She came out anyway. She came out into the doorway with the Henry in her hands, and she saw her man rooted in the heat and the smoke, his amber eye glassy, his huge body locked, and she did the thing she had to do. She slapped him, hard, across the unscarred side of his face. Caleb, you are not in Pueblo. You are here, with me, with us. Come back. Come back to me. His eyes cleared. He looked at her, just for a heartbeat. He nodded once. He raised the sharps. The hired man was running across the open ground at the cabin with a pistol in each hand. Caleb shot him through the chest at 20 yards. The man went down and did not get up. That left Sterling. Sterling had a small revolver. He had not expected this. He had expected 8 armed men to be enough to take a cabin held by 3 brothers, and he had been wrong, and he was a banker, not a fighter. And he stood in the open snow, now with a useless little gun in his hand and the firelight on his face, and the firelight folks did not flatter him. He fired wild. One shot caught Caleb in the left shoulder. The big man staggered back a step, but he did not go down. He did not even drop the rifle. He came down off the porch at Sterling, slow the way a mountain comes down at a man. Sterling fired again. The bullet missed. Sterling pulled a long knife from his coat. The knife folks down in Denver had whispered about the knife 3 dead wives had never seen coming. He ran at Caleb in the open snow. Caleb caught Sterling's wrist in his huge scarred hand. The big man's grip closed, and there was a sound, a small, crisp, wet sound of small bones giving way, and Sterling screamed. The knife dropped. Caleb threw him. Reginald Ashworth Sterling went down in the snow on his back, and when he tried to rise, he found that Della Whitmore had walked up out of the burning cabin doorway with the Henry rifle in her hands, and she had set the muzzle of the rifle 3 inches from his forehead, and she was looking down at him with a calm, cold quiet that did not anymore belong to a Boston preacher's daughter. She did not pull the trigger. She held the rifle there until Caleb came up beside her, and she looked at her man and she said very quietly, "This is yours, Caleb, not mine." Caleb took the rifle from her hands. He looked down at the man who had bought her and meant to bury her. The fire roared behind them. The cabin he had built with his own hands 10 years before was burning to the ground, and he found in that moment that he did not mind. A cabin was wood. A cabin could be built again. There were other things on this mountain that mattered more. "She will not be your fourth," Caleb said. He pulled the trigger. Sterling did not move again. The fight was over. The cabin burned. Wyatt came down off the ridge, his rifle smoking a long red graze across his forearm, but otherwise sound. He put his arms around Caleb and Della both, and the 3 of them stood in the fire-lit snow and watched the home Caleb had built come apart in slow orange tongues. Silas hobbled out behind them. He stood at the edge of the porch, leaning on the doorframe, his wounded leg held off the ground, his face in the firelight, very tired and very young. "Well," said Wyatt finally, "that is one way to do spring cleaning." Silas, against everything, laughed. Caleb did not laugh. He pulled Della tighter against his good shoulder. He looked down at the top of her honey head, where it pressed against the rough wool of his coat, and he kissed her hair once, and he said very low only to her, "You are home now, Della Whitmore. You hear me? You are home now." She nodded into his coat. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They rode down off the mountain 4 days later with Silas in a wagon and Caleb on the seat and Della beside him and Wyatt riding flanker. They went to the territorial marshal at Silver Creek, a tall, lean man named Bartholomew Crane, and Caleb laid the whole story on his desk in plain words. Marshal Crane listened. He did not interrupt. When Caleb was done, the marshal opened a drawer and took out a folder thick as a Bible. Sterling had been on his desk for 3 years. 3 dead wives, 2 missing housekeepers, a young laundress from Kansas City the marshal had never been able to bring proof on. It was said Marshal Crane the fastest case of self-defense he had ever closed. He stood up. He shook Caleb's hand. He shook Wyatt's. He bowed his head to Della. He did not ask them to come back. The Reverend Nathaniel Whitmore came west by train in the spring of 1875. He came thinking he would find his daughter broken. He found her instead standing on a half-built porch in a pair of work boots and a man's flannel shirt, with her hair pinned up under a straw hat, hammering a board into place with her own hands. He stood by the wagon a long while and did not speak. Then she saw him. She set the hammer down. She walked across the meadow and she put her arms around her father, and the Reverend Whitmore wept into his daughter's hair, the way he had not wept since the day his wife died. "Forgive me," he said. "Already done, Father," she said, "a long time ago." He married them 3 weeks later in a meadow above the burned cabin. The new house was half built behind them. The pine boards were fresh. The wood smelled of resin in the spring sun. Wyatt stood up for Caleb. Silas stood beside him. Caleb had cut his own hair clean again that morning, and his face in the noon light was a face he had decided finally to let the world see. Della wore a simple white cotton dress she had sewn herself. She wore wildflowers in her honey hair. Her father's voice broke when he came to the part about loving and cherishing, and he had to stop a moment, and Caleb Thorne reached across and laid his huge scarred hand on the old man's shoulder, and the Reverend Whitmore steadied. He finished the words. He pronounced them husband and wife. Caleb bent down. Della rose up. They kissed once soft in front of God, and 3 brothers and an old preacher in a Colorado meadow full of blue lupine, and the long winter of Thorn Mountain ended that afternoon. That night they walked together to the small new cabin Caleb and Wyatt and Silas had built for them in the meadow. And the door closed soft behind them, and the spring stars came out over the high pines, and the world Della Whitmore had been bought to enter back in Boston was a world she would never enter now and would never need to. The years moved. They always do. Folks, if you are still riding this campfire with me, hit that like button one more time. Tell me where you are listening from. We are coming up on the part of this story where the years take over the telling, and I want you with me when the children come. Their first child was born in the spring of '76, a boy. They named him Ezekiel after the boy in Pueblo, who had grown up safe because of what Caleb did in the foundry, though they had never seen him again. They called him Zeke. Caleb Thorne, the morning Zeke was born, sat by the bed with his huge hands wrapped around his son, and he said to Della, very quiet, "I did not know a man could feel this." Della smiled up at him, tired and bright-eyed. "Now you know," she said. Their second child was born in '78, a girl. They named her Grace. She had her mother's blue eyes and her father's dark hair, and she could outrun her brother by the time she was 4. Wyatt married a young school teacher named Tabitha Brennan in the fall of '79. She had come west from Indiana to teach at the Silver Creek Schoolhouse, and she had walked into the general store one afternoon in a green dress, and Wyatt Thorne, who had laughed at his brothers about every woman they had ever looked at, was sunk before he reached the door. They built their cabin a quarter-mile from the main house. They had 4 children of their own. Silas took longer. He was a quiet man. He had buried Mrs. Hartwell, and he had nearly bled to death on a snowy trail for a Boston girl he had come to call sister, and he was in no hurry. But in 1882, a young woman named Winifred Holloway came into Silver Creek to clerk at the bank, and Silas saw her one Sunday morning in church, and when he came home, he sat at the supper table and said very quiet, "I think I have met the woman I am going to marry." Caleb looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Caleb. They did not laugh. 2 years later, Silas and Winnie were married. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Silas, the silent one, never stopped looking at his wife the way a man looks at the answer to a question he had been asking for a very long time. Grace, when she was old enough, fell in love with a young rancher down the valley named Jeremiah Calloway, and Caleb Thorne, who had once decided he was not fit for any woman to love, walked his daughter down the meadow on a summer afternoon in 1899 and gave her to a good man with a steady hand and a clean look in his eye. Zeke married a year later. He took over the forge his father had rebuilt by then, and he became, folks said, the finest blacksmith in Larimer County. They called the place Three Brothers Ranch. It had grown by then to 2,000 acres. The cabin Caleb had built with his hands at 20 years old had been replaced with a long, low ranch house of pine and stone with a wide porch on the south side that caught the sun all year. The forge was at the bottom of the meadow. The barn Caleb had once slept in stood still repaired and added to full of working horses and a milk cow. The graves of Caleb's parents had been moved up from Pueblo and laid together under a pine on the ridge, and Mrs. Hartwell's grave had been moved beside them because Silas had asked. 30 years passed, folks, 30 years. It was the autumn of 1904 when the last scene of this story took place. Caleb Thorne was 60 years old. His dark hair had gone gray at the temples. The scar on the right side of his face had softened into the rest of his weather the way old wounds do, and folks who had grown up in Silver Creek did not anymore see anything strange about it. They just saw old Caleb Thorne, who shod their horses, who paid his bills on the day they were due, who sat in the third pew of the church on Sunday with his wife beside him and his sons and daughters and grandchildren in a long row down the aisle. Della was 52. There was silver in her honey hair. The small lines at the corners of her cornflower eyes were the lines of a woman who had laughed often in her life at the men around her table. They sat together that afternoon on the porch of the long, low ranch house. 6 grandchildren ran in the meadow below them, 4 boys and 2 girls chasing each other through the late blue lupine. 2 of them belonged to Zeke, 2 to Grace. The other 2 blonde ones were Wyatt's grandchildren who were over for the day. The dogs ran with them. The light was gold. Caleb watched them. He was quiet a long time. Della, he said. She turned. She knew that tone. He had used it perhaps 4 times in 30 years. Yes, my love. Do you remember he said the night I told you on the porch of the old cabin that I did not have anything to give you, that I was just a man with a face the world did not want to look at and a barn to sleep in? I remember, she said. Look at them, he said. She looked. That is what you gave me, he said. That is what we made. A whole world. Out of 2 people the world had thrown away. Della took his huge scarred hand between her own 2 smaller ones, the way she had on the night he told her about Pueblo, and she lifted it and she pressed it to her cheek. Her cheek was no longer the cheek of a Boston girl. It was lined and warm in the color of clean honey in the afternoon light. You were never thrown away, Caleb Thorne, she said. The world only thought it had thrown you away. The mountain knew better. The mountain chose you, and then the mountain chose me, and here we are. Here we are, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had leaned it that night on the cold porch before the 7 days began. The same shoulder, bigger now in his old wool coat, slower than it once had been, but still the same. He kissed the top of her head where the silver had come into the honey, and he closed his amber eye against the autumn sun, and he listened to the laughter of his grandchildren down in the meadow, and he thought with no small wonder that a man could live a whole long life and never know what he had been kept alive for, and then know it all at once on a porch at 60. Folks, that is the end of the story I had to tell you tonight. Cordelia Whitmore stepped off a train 2 miles short of Denver in November of 1874 because a stranger on a train told her the truth about the man who had bought her. She walked into a Colorado pine wood in a silk dress and fine leather shoes, and she nearly died there. 3 brothers found her in the snow. The eldest of them carried her 3 miles through a blizzard and slept in his own barn for 3 weeks rather than ask her to look at his face by daylight. She looked at him anyway. She looked at every part of him. She held his hand across a long pine table and told him there was no wound in the room, only a man, and she meant it, And a long winter of two lives ended in that one quiet sentence. A man keeps his word. A woman keeps her own counsel. Winter always ends. The mountain does not care, but sometimes the people who live on it do. And that in the end was enough. If this story warmed you tonight, hit the like button. Subscribe for more. Tell me in the comments who you would have ridden with up that southern trail, the steady one, the bright one, or the quiet one. And let me know where you are listening from, because the campfire I started this story by is still burning, and you are welcome at it anytime. Until next time, friends, keep your boots dry, keep your axe sharp, and remember, somewhere out there on a mountain you have never seen, a porch is waiting with a chair on it that no one has ever sat in but you. Good night.